My guest today is Sheila Ngoc Pham, a writer, editor, producer, and scholar working across radio, print, online, and film. Sheila is based in Sydney, Australia, and over the time that we've known each other, Sheila's been really helpful in helping me contact guests all over Australia. She writes for a wide range of publications and previously held digital and editorial roles at the ABC. I value her openness and willingness to approach many different subjects inside and outside of the Vietnamese culture. Please join us today as we catch up with the current work that Sheila is doing in her hometown. Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over.
Hey, I'm Sheila Ngoc Pham. I'm a writer, producer, and I'm also the curator of an exhibition that is currently showing at the Fairfield City Museum and Gallery called Minh, which focuses on Vietnamese and Vietnamese Chinese writers and artists, exploring, diasporic experience here in Sydney.
Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Yeah, because I spoke to you, was it last year or maybe the year before even?
It's been probably over a year. It's when you covered for The Guardian the rock
Bung Tam, yeah.
Bung Tam. Bung Tam. Mi Tam is a singer from Vietnam. Yes, Bung Tam. And that's when we reached out and we had a conversation, and it was awesome. So now, how did you come into this project of curating this museum exhibition?
Yeah, so I do a lot of different things and a lot focused on, the Vietnamese experience in different ways. I've only ever curated one other exhibition, and that's another interesting story, actually, which I'm speaking about later this month in Sydney at the State Library. There's amazing collection of Dom Ho paintings that the library holds that two Australians collected in the 50s. Anyway, I curated an exhibition, and actually I was just thinking about it today because that exhibition ran just before COVID hit. It pretty much started December 2019, and then it ended like mid-March 2020 when the whole world changed. But that was my first experience with curating an exhibition. So that was just a small one featuring like this, basically vintage folk art from the 50s from Vietnam. And then so, fast forward, I ended up doing some work with the Fairfield City Museum and Gallery, which is a small suburban museum. And it's basically located in pretty much like the heartland of the Vietnamese community here in Sydney, in Southwest Sydney. And I did some work with them in a previous exhibition where they got me on board with a bunch of other writers, and we were responding to museum objects. And one of the obvious things that came out of that project was that even though the museum is located in the Vietnamese neighborhood, basically, and other groups as well, but let's say Vietnamese is the main group, they didn't really have any Vietnamese objects in their collection, like nothing. Literally, there's one bowl of pho, like the plastic one, the one that's like, you probably say in America, the one that's kind of got that red pattern that kind of looks Chinese.
Yeah.
So there's one tokenistic plastic bowl that someone donated to the museum in the 90s or something. But yeah, so that was one of the gaps in the collection. And so there was a curator who was working there, and she just had a baby, so she's not there at this stage, but she'll come back. And she's actually Dutch, and she did some research into the museum's archives, and the museum's been going, I think it was officially established maybe in the 80s by basically the white Australians who were living in the neighborhood, and they wanted to start up a museum. And then she realized that in the last 40 years, basically, there just had never been an exhibition about the Vietnamese experience in the area. So it was like this huge gap. And because, she'd gone to know me through this other exhibition where, I was writing about some of the objects and that. And then she knew that I had like a lot of knowledge about, Vietnamese diaspora. She asked me to come on board, like to, do this exhibition. So I have to give credit to her. It was actually her instigating this and her doing research into the museum's archives and just realizing that there just had never been just like a exhibition, which seems really like a huge gap, obviously.
Let's take it a few steps back. How the hell do you know how to curate a museum? How do you understand, and where did you learn how to curate an exhibition? Because I know you as a writer, you write very well and you get really deep into a subject. I only imagine that it's probably close and similar to putting together an exhibition, but that sounds to me like it's a whole different level of training professionally.
Yeah, and I'm not a professionally trained curator, but I would say that I've probably been to a lot of exhibitions. I think it's like with a lot of these things. I don't think you need a degree personally. I mean, maybe I don't want to like devalue degrees in museum studies because obviously there's a lot of theory behind a lot of this. But I mean, I guess it's the same with writing. I don't have a writing degree, but I read a lot. You know, I do a lot of things just from watching, right, and learning. Like I'm about to write a play, and that's, you know, I don't have a degree in writing a play, but I have watched a lot of plays. So, you know, I think you develop instincts. And so with me, exhibitions, I mean, I've probably seen, I don't know, like 100 exhibitions at least in my life, right? And, you know, over the years, over like 20 something years, I've been to heaps of museums, heaps of galleries. And I guess it takes a long time though. Like at the beginning, you're kind of just in awe of the whole thing. You're like, oh wow, that's amazing. But then as you become a bit more discerning and you kind of develop your own taste, and you realize that not all exhibitions are necessarily that amazing. Sometimes there's points that are not, you know, that strong, or things, you know, maybe artworks you don't really like, but that's okay too. I think that's totally fine to not love every bit of an exhibition, but it is cool when you go to an exhibition and you just love it and you're like, oh, I love that exhibition. So, yeah, so I guess I approached the whole thing kind of instinctually. Like I don't think of myself as being some kind of, this is my career. I don't think I have a career. I just have lots of different things that I do all the time, you know, and I'm interested in stories, right? So this is and the Vietnamese thing, I'll always have to come back to that. It's going to be a lifelong project, just like it is for you, right? Like it's so much like a part of our own identity and foundation.
Yeah.
And we also see there's a need for people like us to help bring these stories to life.
You know, recently I've been listening to another podcast, Mark Maron. He interviews so many people, and he's been doing it one of the longest in the US, and he's a comedian, and he talks about like the first 300 episodes that he did was really for himself and to navigate. So I am asking, I realize I do that. I do that a lot. I ask questions based on what I kind of want to know in the directing of my life. So the question that I have for you as a curator is, it's so reflective of my own thinking, is how do you know who to pick? What is your process to keep this person in? And it's very inclusive or exclusive, right? This idea of curating.
Oh, totally. I mean, you'd have the same dilemma. I mean, okay, so here's a catalog. So it's Mun. And yeah, so it's running to middle of October. So if people are in Sydney, they, you know, please check it out. Look, I mean, I want to be honest though. It's not like it was just me doing this. Like, and I think that's important to acknowledge. It's not just my vision. I mean, obviously, I brought a lot into this, and you know, I came up with the title. I came up with pretty much most of the artists, but not all the artists, because the museum itself, it has, even though it has never had an exhibition like this, over the years, it has developed relationships with local Vietnamese artists. So, and not just, and I would want to qualify Vietnamese Chinese as well. So I'll talk about that a bit more, because I think that that's something that I really wanted to emphasize. That in the Vietnamese diaspora, there are a lot of Viet Chinese basically, and we don't talk about that enough. And I feel like we need to make that really clear. Yeah, so then it really was a collaboration between me and the museum. And I also, you know, from the very outset, I just knew that you can't include every single person. So there are certainly some Vietnamese artists that I haven't included in the exhibition. I mean, it's only a small space as well. So yeah, and actually I should explain, it's a very small museum, by the way. So curating it wasn't like me curating like a major art institution or something. It's just a small museum. But in the end, we were able to include 17 writers and artists. And I really was emphasizing this mixture of more established older artists with, you know, people who are like young and in their 20s. And so in some of the works, older works that I already knew of, or like the artist told me about, and some of the works are just brand new, commissioned by the museum. And I also thought that was important, because I've been to a lot of exhibitions where the emphasis is on, you know, the new, like, you know, the latest works, everything is brand new, young artists. I understand that excitement, but I was trying to tell a different story here, which is about that, you know, we've now been in this area, and I guess in Australia for like basically over 40 years. And I wanted the works in a way to reflect that kind of story. So, and I also wanted to acknowledge that even though this is the first exhibition in this museum, that in another exhibition space in another neighborhood, which is in Southwest Sydney as well, but in a place called Castula Powerhouse, there used to be this Vietnamese curator, Gung, and he left the sector ages ago. He lives in Vietnam again, but he did do a couple of Vietnamese exhibitions in the 2000s, and I did go to them when I was young, in my 20s. And so I tried to acknowledge that as well in the space. So yeah, I guess there was a lot of stuff I wanted to do in this small exhibition. It wasn't just about showcasing writers and artists, but it was also about acknowledging the history that's come before us, And that also reflects in the artworks that are displayed, because there's actually like one artwork, which is actually from an artist who's not from this area, but from Melbourne, but it's about the boat journey. And his work does feature oral histories with like me and a few other people over the last 10 years. And so, yeah, okay, sorry, it's a long, complicated answer, but basically there were a lot of considerations, and I knew that I had to try and hit as many of those considerations as possible, even if it's not possible to include every single aspect of the, diasporic experience. But I wanted, the Viet experience to be pretty well represented by an exhibition like this.
Now, when you curate in your mind, do you write down the criteria or is it gut?
It's all gut, like, I'm sure you understand this too. It's sort of hard to replicate exactly like the process. Like, I do want to train people, and I'm always trying to encourage other people to do this kind of work, right? But I mean, all I can say is that it's over like years and years of just thinking about this stuff, obsessing about it. It becomes very instinctual. And so like, for example, now I can just do a tour of the exhibition space. And you know what? I didn't even know half of what the artist would be coming up with, because some of the works were brand new, literally down to the wire. People didn't finish the work until like the day before.
Like high school.
But yeah. But it was like, but I knew like you just have to trust the process a little bit too, right? And and I'm not saying it's going to be like a perfect exhibition, but I kind of knew that my instinct was, I wanted that artist because I knew that they use humor in their work. I wanted that artist because they are looking at Vietnamese artifacts. So there's two artists that have a dom sung drum, and then they respond to it too. So that goes back thousands of years. And so, yeah, but it's something about, I mean, one thing, I'm actually not a control freak either, I guess is the other thing. I'm kind of happy to just, there's a bit of chaos in all these things, but you do have to set it up. It doesn't happen naturally. You got to like, choose the people that you put them in position basically. And then from there, you just have to trust the process. So yeah, and there's nothing written down. I'm not like sitting there with a mental check. Like I do have a mental checklist, but I don't have a written one where I'm going, I need this, this, and this. I just have to guess that older artists, younger artists. I said there's like about 4 or 5 now with Chinese backgrounds too, but who are Vietnamese diaspora as well. And so yeah, all of those things I did think about. So everything's deliberate though. I wouldn't say that there's every bit of that puzzle is there because I had a hand in it, but I didn't necessarily choose exactly what that would look like.
And that's part of the beauty of it. And I want to go back to the artist that you had mentioned about the boat. What's his name?
Fungo.
Fungo. So I was reading his, and I think he was doing 2 things, right? He was eating like for 10 days, he's going to eat what his parents had on the journey. And he also, at the end of the exhibition, I think he's making origami to burn all the little boats that he's doing, right?
Yeah, actually, I should explain. So no, he's not going to do the same thing this time, but that's what he did a couple of years ago. So So he was in a major art institution here in Australia, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art, which is here in Sydney. So he's normally based in Melbourne, but he flew up, and then for 10 days he lived in the gallery and literally just ate rations, like replicating the boat journey in that way, right? Honoring what his parents went through, what a lot of our parents went through. And then at the end of it, and I was there for the end of it, he basically had this beautiful kind of setup at the front of the museum, and all these people gathered around, and he burnt the boats to kind of honor the lives of the dead. And so he's done this a few times now, but that was the last time, was a couple of years ago. And and he's become a friend because I've known him now for also like a good 10 years. Since I first met him, he interviewed me for this project, and that's how we initially connected. But I really wanted to bring that in because it's interesting, because the boat journey, there's a lot of pushback sometimes from the second gen in a way about how come, and it's true too, that how come that's the only story that people know about the Vietnamese, like in Australia. Like everyone just thinks of Viets as like boat people or like drug dealers, like basically those are the stories. But having said that, and I have to say, as I get older, I don't know what your thoughts about this, but the more and more I think about that boat journey, the more harrowing it seems. Like, it just seems like, what the hell? I think I would have been one of those people who just stayed behind, because I'm like, why would I go in a boat and risk my life? And, a lot of people died, like hundreds of thousands just went missing for lots of reasons, pirates, drownings, whatever. And so I did want to have one work in the exhibition which honors that, and Fung understands this. That's why he did the work. He understands the importance of that story. And interestingly, in the work, it's more about if you put the headphones on and then you fold boats while you're listening, a lot of it's more like the second gens reflecting on what we know of this history. And so then when I listened to it, and I hadn't heard myself in like years, but I listened to myself, and it was really weird listening to myself at 32 talking about what I understood of my parents' boat journey. And I don't know, these days I think I would talk about it a bit differently. Maybe I have kids now, I understand these things differently, but 10 years ago I had another way of understanding that. And I think the story keeps evolving, even though it's like an old story. Like I said, now I just think of it, I just get even more freaked out thinking about that story. It just seems so freaky, don't you think? Like
It's
that people from Vietnam got in
it,
boats and just left.
it really is. And you get sick of hearing about the war, but then you think about it. You really think about it. You're like, wait a minute. From north to south, it was in tatters, like bombed out and constantly bullets flying. I mean, you look at like pictures of and images of Ukraine today, and you're just like, wait, that was us 50 years ago. And it's one of those things where we can't stop thinking. You can't stop thinking about it. But at some point, like I need to take a break from the imagery and the stories and thinking about the boats and the water and the ocean. But when I read the pamphlet the PDF that you sent me, it resonated, and the way he did it, and I was like, that's the beauty of art and artists, where they can kind of like reimagine things and put things into our minds and make us think and imagine and recreate things that we think about, we hear, we're bored of it, but contextually when they reframe things, it really hits. And I that's why I like talking about this stuff. But you're right, it's like second generation. When I hear about boat people, we're just sometimes it's exhausting.
It is exhausting, and same with the war. I mean, so interestingly, so one of the things I'm doing as part of this exhibition is there's a series of public programs, which means like, talks and that around the exhibition. And the one I just had on Sunday was amazing. It was actually held at the library, so not at the museum. So in Cabramatta, so not far from where the museum is. So I don't know if maybe you've heard about Cabramatta. It's like the heartland of, Vietnamese Australia. And it the talk that I brought together, it was G Wei Mai, like Nguyen Phan Wei Mai, Andre Dow, who's just written a book as well, and Tracy Ling. He also just wrote a book set in Cabramatta, and she lives in the US. And there was a question at the end. It was such an interesting talk because the authors were brilliant, all of them. It was such an insightful discussion. And I chaired the discussion. But at the end, one of the questions from the audience was this young woman got up, probably in her 20s, and she said, don't you worry, and she was addressing to the writers, don't you worry that by focusing on the war, you're just perpetuating this narrative that Vietnam is this war-torn country. What about it as a country aside from that? Something like that. I mean, it was an interesting question, but I mean, the thing is, like, we are the diaspora, so our lives are basically founded on the fact that our parents left because of the war. So it's not really up to us, I think. And I didn't. And at that point, do where my and although they were answered, so I didn't get to answer. But I'm going to answer now. But I think though that that's the job of the Vietnamese in Vietnam now, really, to tell the story of contemporary Vietnam. And I don't think that that's my place really to talk about what Vietnam is like now. Sometimes I touch it on my writing a little bit, but I'm a foreigner there. Like I don't come from there anymore. I don't know what Vietnam is like, to talk in the depth that I can talk about the experience of us here.
Wow, that's a very cool sort of setup that you went through to hear that question from a young woman. And I think, why don't we have agency to answer however we want? I mean, right? If you think about it, like I go back to Vietnam twice a year. I can answer that from my experience of being in Vietnam, and I do all the time. But I also reserve the right to talk about the war or the experience of my family coming from the war as much as I want. And I want to know what Chi Quay Mai and Tracy and Andre, how did they answer?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I don't know if I can summarize. And unfortunately, I didn't record this talk, which was amazing. But I mean, Tracy did basically acknowledge, well, that's the truth of like how the community started in Australia was the war. But you're right. I think but I thought the question was provocative. Like, I mean, I felt like I really wanted to answer it, but right at the end of the talk. But I think it's a good question, though. I mean, I want to say respect to that girl for asking that question. It's a good question, even though I might disagree with it in a way like you too, because. But I also I went to Vietnam for a month, the start of the year too with my kids. I'm also getting to know Vietnam as a, living, breathing place. But the war is still part of it too, I want to say, and that's why I did mention it in the talk at some other point, where the thing I found about Vietnam, and you maybe have this experience, is it's true. A lot of people don't want to talk about the war, especially young people. They're not that interested. But you know what? I do meet people who do want to talk about the war as well, like older people who remember, who lived through it, and then they're always interested in like the Viet Kill, like who come back. And then I had a couple of really interesting chats with people who remember the war, like or veterans who, from the South, for example, they didn't leave, they didn't leave the country, and they're still there. And then they don't get the chances to talk about it much because who are they going to talk to about it? So then I think that's life, right? Very complicated, but all these things are true. That one, yes, it's a place that a lot of people, it's moved on in some ways. People don't want to talk about it. The younger generation don't remember it. But I guess I would always argue that war does matter in every society. Like it's not, maybe we don't want to glorify it. We don't want to like re-traumatize ourselves constantly. But as just a simple truth of life, there was a war. It was very painful. It caused a lot of death. And that's why I'm really grateful to these writers and artists. And, Ji Wei Mai, her book, the new book, Dust Child, it talks about this other legacy of the war, which is all the mixed race kids, from the American soldiers. That's still going on. Like whether people like it or not, these people live with the consequences of a war that began, 40, 50 years ago or more. And even Andre Dow, his book is all about, and he's one I really related to in a different way because his grandfather was a prisoner, political prisoner in Vietnam for 10 years. And so then as a grandson growing up in Australia, he tries to make sense of that. Like, what does that mean? And so maybe like, but when I read it, I understood the heaviness of that question, like some of us, and maybe not all, I want to say not all Viets our age, maybe think about this stuff too much, right? But then the ones who do, we're the ones who end up working as storytellers, as writers, as, hosting podcasts, making programs, running exhibitions, because we believe it's important to reflect on these kinds of stories.
And I would take it another step further, which is, what about the Jewish community in the Holocaust? They're not perpetuating Holocaust stories. They're really letting the world know, like, hey, let's not do this again. That was a bad idea. And I think for us, war is a bad idea. It's, no matter how you look at it, it's a bad idea. However, we are a byproduct of that war. And it's hard to divorce our genetics, our living molecular kind of experience. How can we divorce who we are from that experience? She might just be bored of it and she said, let's move on. I mean, I think that's more of it, which I think if my daughter, my son ever said that to me, I would relate to it. I would understand it. Like, hey, daddy, you're always talking about the war. Okay, I get that. But I think if you are going to say, well, if we keep talking about it, it's perpetuating, I don't know. I don't agree with that.
Yeah, but and it's interesting. Yes, and just to say, but it's interesting because I actually did bring up the Jewish thing myself in the talk because I think about the Jews, and like they're like diaspora, like the first diaspora, right, in some ways. Yep. We're just like following in their footsteps. I mean, the Vietnamese diaspora just started much later in history, right? Like we're recent, 20th century product. But the thing about the Jews, which I find so interesting, is they have a way of learning to memorialize their own kind of suffering. Absolutely. And they have the days to honor. And yeah, and so then I think there's something important in that because, and another thing we talked about, which, and Ji Wei Mai and Andre both had really interesting answers because the idea of silence around this sort of stuff. So Andre, in his book, he talks a lot about this, but in the end, the silence, he thinks that in some ways, his kind of understanding is that some of our parents who didn't talk about these things, our grandparents, the silence was to help the next generation have a chance and not be burdened by the sorrow. But then on the other hand, like Ji Wei Mai was saying, but the thing is like, it is important to talk about these things because then we can communalize our trauma, is this expression she used. And so, but I think both things are kind of true. It's like, this having kids, there's a fine line between, I don't want to burden my children with all the crap that I inherited, like all that stuff. But at the same time, I do want them to know the truth because it's important that they understand this is their legacy. This is why we're here in Australia. Because there was this painful experience in our family's history, and it caused a lot of, and it will continue to cause a lot of intergenerational trauma, because like you said, we've kind of inherited this stuff now, right? It's basically in our DNA. And I do, and I'm trying my best to change the course of my own parenting journey and not perpetuate the stuff from my family, right? But even so, it's still there. I can't avoid it all because I wouldn't be the person I am if I didn't kind of go through all that stuff with in a Vietnamese refugee family. And in a way, I guess I would say I'm grateful for it, really. Like, what else can I say? I didn't want to suffer, like a lot of people don't. But then it makes you who you are. And then from that, you can find the beauty. And maybe if I had had a different kind of family life, I just would become a very different person now.
Yeah. And I want to go back to what you said about being storytellers. We are interested in this because we tell stories. And I would even go back to my mom and dad. I really wish that they actually talked more about it. It wasn't that they were afraid of us not being normal or they wanted to burden with us. They didn't care about any of that. My parents were just, the happy-go-lucky people. I think that they were just lazy to talk about the experience. They didn't think it was a big deal, perhaps. But I wish they would have sat me down and said, let's spend a week or let's spend 2 days a year and memorialize the things that we went through and share with you. And perhaps you can write this down and know about, what it felt like. I had an uncle who was in the Phoenix program. I think he came to Quantico, Virginia to train under the CIA twice. I would love to have, he died before I started the podcast. I wish I had more time with that man, my dad's older brother, to hear about what his experience in the war was like, and I find it fascinating. Just me personally, I like that. I like to hear it. And I can understand if it was my daughter or some young woman in her 20s and she's like, oh my God, this again. And I can understand it, but I would probably sit my daughter down and say, no, like this is why it's important. And then make parallels to what the Jewish diaspora goes through.
Yeah, and the thing about the Jewish thing and talking about it with you, I mean, that's, and I don't know if we talked about this last time. We might have even touched on it last time even, but I think this is where like the Jews have this advantage in terms of like they're like an ethno-religion, right? And so then they can kind of put into their rituals. And I think this is where we're much more fragmented, the Viets, like, because, obviously, and even like, even if you're Catholic or Buddhist, and I mean, there are rituals that, but it's not so explicitly about telling stories, it's about honoring the ancestors and honoring the dead in that way. And so there is a memory there, but it's not so much like this. Yeah, we don't communalize the trauma enough, to use Joe Meyer's expression, which I think that's where like it would be good to hear those stories in that way. I don't know, I mean, I grew up with a dad though who talked a lot about this stuff, but in a way which I think I wasn't protected from the horrors of the war enough, probably. But maybe, so in that way, I actually don't want to necessarily talk to my dad about it anymore. I feel like I've heard a lot of his version of the war. But it is, yeah, but then I feel conflicted because there are things I'd like to know more about. But what I do these days is I get my husband to ask him, because I feel like then it's easier from man to man, and my husband, he's a white Australian,
Yeah.
he's a bit outside of the experience. And my dad loves him like a son anyway. And there is this kind of sexist thing in my family around girls and boys and all this sort of stuff. But it's easier that I just say to Josh, hey, can you ask, I'll say to him, can you ask my dad about blah, blah? Because sometimes it's just easier.
Wow.
And then if I want some details, because I do. I mean, I'm not honestly. I mean, I see my dad like 5 times a week. I see him all the time, but then reopening these wounds can be a bit risky, I find, in my family's case, because my parents have, for the most part, mostly healed, although not so healed that they've never gone back to Vietnam, for example. And and increasingly, I feel like my family, one of those few families left, where my parents just left more than 40 years ago, and then they just never returned. And so I had to keep going for my sake. So
Yeah.
I want to return. I want to have a relationship to Vietnam. I want my kids to have a relationship, but my parents, they left it all behind them in 1980 and they've just never come back.
One of the things I think about for the topics in the Vietnamese podcast, or when I sit down with people like you, really curators of culture, I think about the future of Vietnamese youth. And I think about what the 3rd, 4th generation would turn out to be like. Are they just going to be simple Australians, simple Americans? Or are they going to have this layer of identity that they can reach back into and draw from, sort of like the Japanese community? I don't know what the Japanese community in Australia is like, but many of the Japanese in America still practice many of the traditions that their parents have left, whether it's Kempo or whether it's going to learn calligraphy, or they go to Japanese class, and that kind of like remembrance, that memory of your traditional, your background, even though you're 4th, 5th generation Japanese now, is a beautiful thing. But I wonder if the Vietnamese are going to hold on to certain aspects of their pride.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I think about a lot. Obviously, it's one of my favorite concerns as well. But I mean, my impression is that I think we integrate too well, that we're sort of losing some of that identity. Language gets dropped very quickly. Other aspects of culture, like, the Vietnamese, after the rocky initial start in Australia, I guess it's probably similar to America. I just think like the Vietnamese have really flourished, like have done really well, but that's come at a cost as well. Like that, there is a kind of distance from our roots, I think.
Big time.
You know, and so yeah, so that's the trade-off, you know, like, and that's, I mean, that's the kind of the double-edged sword of like, you know, migrating, right? Like you have that experience of like having a chance, you know, and you know, and these days I know a lot of Vets now, younger Vets who actually who grew up in Vietnam, and then they've come here as adult migrants. You know, they go to the US, they go to Australia, you know, they came as international students, and then they've stayed. And I think it's really interesting, kind of talking to some of them too, because you know, one of them, for example, this young man I've become friends with, and he just says, you know, but he knew that the education in Vietnam was not good compared to what he could get overseas. And so he's happy living here. There's more freedom. There's, you know, clean water, fresh air, all of that stuff as well. But you do lose something very precious too. And I think people do feel that you lose a homeland in the same way. Like we're trying our best to recreate something here, right? And luckily there are like, you know, areas like Cabramatta, and I live near Bankstown, which is not far away. And this is areas of Vietnamese life. But I do feel like, you know, I'm on the edges of that a little bit, because I also chose a path where, you know, I got deeper into writing and media and all these things, which are very atypical Vietnamese kind of, you know, even for second gens. Like very few of us work in these areas. And so, yeah, but even aside from that, I meet Vets all the time my age who are probably more typical like doctors and accountants and lawyers and that. And they also, I think, are losing touch with their roots a little bit too. But I mean, how could you maintain it? But, you know, if by being like a professional as well as staying true to home, like that's really hard kind of balance, I think.
But there's also this sort of like people who grew up in Vietnam aren't even thinking about, oh, we're culturally Vietnamese. They're just whoever they are, right? They're not really out to explore any deeper, you know, there's computer programmers, there's people who are working in food, and it's not like some cultural hunt that we are kind of doing, and we're trying to kind of almost create meaning out of this existence of being like in this weird foreign Western world, and we're trying to like build it. But when I go back to Vietnam and it just eases, I just ease back into the culture, and I'm not thinking about it anymore.
Oh, I mean, totally. I mean, and that's the dilemma of being in the diaspora, right? As opposed to being kind of in the homeland. But I want to say though, that's not completely true either. I think from what I've seen is that, you know, there are Vets in Vietnam who also look into the past, who also are interested in like Due Norm or something. You know, they want to know what the history was like before colonization. That you know, there's that movement now of wearing older dress, like Vietnamese style clothing from previous centuries. And so that's like a kind of thing I see in Vietnam too, which is interesting. Like people, there are thoughtful young people there and artists and that living there who are very interested in the past. And so, like for example, at the start of the year, I interviewed an artist in Hanoi, they're in Thailand, and he's such an interesting young guy. Like he's in his 20s, really gifted artist, and he's very interested in like those traditional art forms like Nom Ho paintings and that, and then it influences his contemporary style too. And so people are thinking about tradition and what does it mean to be Vietnamese. But then again, but just like here, they're the minority, I guess.
Yeah,
they're those artists and writers. You know what I mean? They're thinking about this. But there is a question in Vietnam too, because, you know, the thing about going to go to Vietnam, it's like going to a lot of Asian cities. It just becomes like a, you know, homogenous kind of contemporary, you know, I don't know, Asian mega city. Like that's what Saigon feels like, right? Except for the fact that there's food, which is different, obviously, and then language. That's at the bedrock of the kind of culture, which kind of makes that, you know, continuity possible. But like I said, but even the language thing is interesting because, you know, like the writing we use of Vietnamese now, it's pretty new. Like and we've lost, because what happened was when they changed the writing system, Vietnamese lost touch with their own history. We can't read old scripts now. So when you look at, you know, writing from the 1800s and whatever, you know, 1700s, we don't really have that connection in the same way, even though because like 99% of people can't read that writing. So I don't know. I mean, I agree with you that we obsess about these things in a different way. But I think in Vietnam, these are real questions for Vietnam too. And you know, Vietnam is always on the edge of being swallowed again by China. So I think that's what gives them a bit of anxiety, you know. And because there's historical precedent, Vietnam is a tiny state in like, you know, right next to a very powerful neighbor. And you know, we were colonized with them before. Why wouldn't we be colonized with them again one day?
My mom and I were walking in the street the other day, and she said something about you should be. I don't know why Vietnamese people are not even thankful to Alexander Durad, who changed our alphabet, who romanized our alphabet. I go, Mom, we are the only Asian country with a romanized alphabet. How much history do you think was erased in that process? That's what you just brought up, Sheila. And she thought about it. She had nothing to reply. I was like, you want me to thank the colonists, the colonialists that wiped out the way we live, the way we breathe, the way we eat, the way we think? And they gifted us this way of communicating with the outside world because it served their economical purposes at the time. And we're the only country in the entire region with Roman. I mean, what does that even say about the Vietnamese journey, right? That
It's interesting,
somebody...
because I also grew up. My dad was always going on about Alexander Rhodes. Like, and I mean, look, I mean, obviously for some of us, I mean, now having Romanized character names and stuff, it makes it. I mean, I think this is part of the story of why the Viet diaspora has integrated more easily as well. You know, we have less foreign sounding, like, you know, alphabet and all that. And, you know, you go to a restaurant and people can read, like, you know, pho or whatever. But you're right. I mean, this is what I think. It comes at a cost. Like, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, to be fair, I guess before that we had Chinese characters, right? But then the Vietnamese were developing our own writing system based on that. Yeah, exactly. It was Deng Hang, and then there's Ding Ju Norm as well. And so we were developing our own style, but then that got interrupted by the missionaries. And so, you know, yeah, I don't know. I mean,
it's complicated.
It is complicated. And even like, you know, your Catholic background, right? And I'm technically Catholic as well, you know, and Buddhist and but then all these things are introduction. Like Buddhism was an introduction too. Like, what is actually Vietnamese? I don't know. I think the Vietnamese identity, I guess my own conclusion is something like we are originally, like we are like kind of like these true cosmopolitan people. Like we've absorbed so many different influences. The history is so kind of, you know, fragmented, but somehow we've sort of made it our own. And that's why the Vietnamese in that way, compared to some of the other kind of neighboring cultures, we are kind of adaptable in a way, I think. I mean, actually, people have the same argument about the Filipinos, right? Like that's why
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, they come to America, come to Australia, and suddenly they're just like they're just there. And the Vietnamese, in another way, we're not that different either. I think we're kind of a bit less kind of foreign in that sense. Like, yeah, I think about, you know, I went to Catholic school, and suddenly you're just there. You're all Catholics, and you know, in Australia, and then there's an easy entry point because of religion. Yeah, it's not the same for people who are Buddhists, of course, but I think in the refugee waves, Catholics were overrepresented. So that's why a lot of us do identify as Catholic.
But in 200 years, when YouTube and 3D holograms, when we can walk into each other's rooms and cross countries and just digitize our reality and be everywhere all at once, and all the cultures are integrating and there's just one flat culture, one, you know, nobody's wearing anything culturally from anywhere specific, is also a very sad and boring place. But maybe at that point we're worrying about survival rather than these colors and affects of each of our where we come from.
Yeah, I know, but that's the world we're going to now, right? And it's when you go to like a shopping mall in Asia, it's pretty much the same shopping mall in every country in Asia. You know, same brands, even in Australia too. Like it's like Zara, Uniqlo, all of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, we're already kind of here at that point, right? So we are starting to lose some of that, you know, precious kind of difference. I don't know, and I think that is sad personally. As someone who loves culture, I think what makes us, you know, what's so interesting is those differences rather than it being all the same. Because I don't know, but I don't want to, you know, be one of those people who defends like culture to the death, like, because obviously we do have more pressing challenges, and I do think about this, like, you know, so even though I'm, you know, being concerned with doing this Vietnamese exhibition, you know, and also like, you know, I really want to tease out like, you know, the Vietnamese Chinese experience and, you know, looking at some of these different, you know, aspects. But then I'm also kind of at the moment also helping out with this, you know, local campaign to try and get more trees planted, because that's a crisis as well, right? In fact, that's like even, I mean, there are different kinds of crises, you know. Yeah, but I mean, literally, that's what I was working on the moment on the weekend. After I finished the talk, then I was kind of thinking about, okay, this tree campaign, we got to get something in the store in the local paper about it. You know, got to get together with other residents. Mostly, I think I'm the only Vietnamese person actually that in this particular campaign. But it matters, right? My children's future, our future, is at stake because we need more trees planted. And in this neighborhood, this is the one thing, a bad thing about living in a migrant neighborhood. We have the worst local council in this way, I feel, or one of the worst ones, because, you know, like a lot of migrants are just in survival mode, right?
Yeah.
It's really the next generation that then starts maybe caring a bit more about, planting trees or something. But then the people who rule us, like in the council, they totally take us for granted. They take this neighborhood for granted. And so then I do feel this responsibility sometimes. I think I mentioned this to you last time in the podcast. I was thinking maybe I should run for like local council one day.
I was just thinking about that. Why not?
And there's no Vietnamese, and in the area I live, it's a huge Vietnamese population, and there are no, actually, sorry, there is now one Vietnamese councillor, Jessie Nguyen. So she's a young woman who's on council now. Before her, though, for 20 years, I think there was like not a single Vietnamese person, basically.
And this is in Sydney?
This particular area in Sydney. Then the neighboring area, there are Vietnamese councillors, but for some reason, this one, there's just a gap, and I don't know why. Even though we have a very large Vietnamese population here, somehow we just don't have like the local representation. And I think but to be fair, it's not just that the Vietnamese get ignored. I think we all get ignored. All the migrant communities here, their concerns, like it's just all about developers going in and building apartments. The local council, couldn't give a shit about the local community in some ways, I feel. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of half joking about running for council. I'm not going to do it anytime soon, but I do think, unless things improve, I mean, I really care about, trying to have some preservation of culture, or at least continuity, not preservation. It's more about, I want some continuity there. But then I also think, yeah, but other things are important too, like, yeah, environmental concerns and that as well. Yeah, so anyway, so those are some of my preoccupations at the moment, even though I suppose when it comes down to it, when I have free time, which is, hard to come by, I basically do invest it, especially in thinking about Vietnamese stuff, because I do feel a special responsibility that, yeah, I mean, look, the tree stuff matters a lot, but then there are other people who care about that too, but maybe not quite as many people care about this stuff around Vietnamese identity. But I want to train up more people. I want more people to get involved, because it can't just be up to, let's say you and me, Kenneth, we're like in our 40s, right, or something. I'm looking for people in their 30s and 20s who can do this sort of work too, to carry it on. Because otherwise we wouldn't have been successful either if we are the only ones who can do this work. And then people after us, people feel intimidated or they don't get involved, then I think we've also not kind of done the right thing by handing it on.
I was in a meeting last night to plan an event. I can't really talk about exactly what the event is, but it's sort of like what we're talking about right now. How do we get young people to the event and party? And for me, I'm a big party boy. I love to party. I love to get alcohol, and I love to get hundreds of people together but there is a intention behind the gathering that sometimes I don't think enough about. And my thing is like, let's just get everybody in one room. And then the people who are really the culture disbursement teams can really hand down. But it's hard to make this stuff cool. And for me, and my weird philosophy is just bring everybody together that look like each other, that kind of can dress in our eyes, and bring everybody together and put on some like old Saigon rock music, a la Phung Tam, right? And that's what I did for that. And in that way, when we can make it cool and we can make it hip and fashionable and more interesting to the youth, then we have a chance. I think we have a shot. And it leads me to my next question is, how is Min being received in your community? Do the young kids feel like it's a cool thing? Are they even coming? How do you market to them? How do you make it interesting for the youth?
I mean, this is totally a key concern for me as well. And like I said, because I am really concerned about, the next generations. Let alone my daughter's, my daughter's like 6, so I can't even worry about her. I'm thinking about people just even in their 30s and 20s. So one thing I bring into this space, I think, with being, curating this exhibition, is because I don't come from like a curation background. I'm not so concerned about like, how it's worked in other galleries and that. My goal with this exhibition, and I was very clear from the outset, that I want regular people to turn up to this exhibition.
Yeah.
Like that's why, and I'm thinking about, trying to engage the community. And honestly, it's been such a good reception so far. Like when they had the launch, which was the 29th of April, I thought about doing the 30th of April, but in the end, it was the 29th of April. So the eve of the 30th. It was the biggest launch that they've ever had. We had, it's only a small space, but there was like 100 and there was awful weather that day too. But we had like 120, 130 people turn up. which is a lot, which is huge. Like their typical openings are very, very tiny. And I mean, a lot of them were my contacts. I mean, I guess that reflects because I have so many contacts. I'm so well connected, and people, and I am very gratified by this, but people do care about the things that I do. A lot of friends who are not Vietnamese turned up, people who want to support me personally. But then I think people were touched by the exhibition. And actually, and interestingly, I'm from about a couple of weeks before the exhibition. I don't know how they heard about it, but this young guy contacted me. His dad runs a Vietnamese YouTube channel. It's a very cute channel. His dad's probably like, I don't know, maybe young, bit younger than my parents, probably like 60. And he runs a local YouTube channel, and they turn up to the launch opening. And you know what? Half people there had never come to the museum before ever. I think at least half. It was their first time. Heaps of random vids. I'd never met them before. They heard about it somehow. And so, yeah, even like that, the older Vietnamese guy with his young son filming for his YouTube channel, he interviewed me. And it was, I'm waiting for that video to go up because, and I apologize, my Vietnamese is not the best for talking about art and complicated things, but, I can talk well enough just everyday stuff. But he was just saying, as an older guy, he felt so gratified seeing someone younger do this work. He felt really proud of that. And I was really touched. I was like, yeah, I'm trying to honor your generation in some ways, even though the exhibition is not really about focused on the older generation, but in a way it is a testament to them, right? Like the fact that I still care about trying to talk about this is because I care about my heritage and the older generation sacrifices, even though I think I'm trying to shift the story to our generation, right? And then anyway, but even I've just heard randomly from other younger people, like I'm talking next week, I'm having a coffee with these two young women who have a local podcast focused on Asian Australian identity. One of them is Vietnamese. They come from a different world too. They're kind of more like working in agencies. I think they're more like kind of creatives that work in a corporate environment. I don't know how they heard about it, but they visited the exhibition, wrote an Instagram story. I contacted them back and I was like, hey, thanks so much for coming. Do you want to have a chat? They're like, yeah, we'd love to give you some coverage. So, so young people are coming. I don't know how they hear about it. They're bringing their families. And then I was really touched by that one because, I don't know how this young woman is, but, she's in her 20s, I would guess. And she was talking about how it was so amazing to be able to bring her parents and grandparents to an exhibition and for them to understand it as well. Maybe they don't understand everything, but they definitely get a sense of it, right? Because I have things there that would speak directly to them. Like there's also the other thing I haven't mentioned that's really fascinating is so James Nguyen, one of the artists, he has like this incredible collection of Vietnamese antiquities, like these porcelain, not porcelain, just like ceramics and things like that. And so we've displayed that in there as well. I was really worried because this is not a high-tech museum, but we had alarms installed and everything. But this is our heritage as well. And so for everyone, including older generations, they may have never seen this kind of stuff because in the museums here, we don't collect Vietnamese things. It's all Chinese, Japanese, Korean, the kind of things that you're used to when you think about Asian art, but we haven't valued Vietnamese art in the same way. So so I'm really proud so far of like that young people are coming, older people are coming, people who've never come to, they don't think of that kind of museum as theirs. We don't think of museums as being ours because especially the history of it, it was set up by a group of, I think mostly white Australians who probably saw the area was changing and then they wanted to preserve their culture a little bit. But I want to honor that instinct as well because that's what happens, right? And that's why I'm thinking about this stuff because I can see that we're on the verge of losing a lot of this stuff unless we document it, unless we do it. So that's why partnering with a local institution has been wonderful, actually. Like there is a lot of discussion in the arts too about, white gatekeepers and white institutions. And it's totally correct that is exactly what it's like. But I've also had a very positive experience of trying to work with people because people in those institutions want to change things too. They don't always know how to, but there is a lot of goodwill there. And I've personally found it, sometimes it can be a bit challenging being like, and I know people see me as just like this kind of Asian Vietnamese woman, they don't see me as like a fully flashed like 360-degree person with a lot of skills. Sometimes they see me in a kind of slightly narrow way just based on my race, but having said that, like overall I find the experience has been really positive of trying to get our stories into these big institutions as well. Like it still matters, like and even actually on Friday last week, gosh, it's been a busy time. So I had a conversation with Ji Wei Mai and Andre Dao at the Sydney Writers Festival. So this is the major literary festival in town. Wow. Thousands and thousands of people come, multi-million-dollar festival these days. And in the audience, there's probably only maybe about 10 bits, maybe less. And but then I was talking to them afterwards, and of course I pretty much talked to every single one of them afterwards because it was a good session. Oh my God, they were both fantastic, so easy to speak to. It was such a good talk as well, even though it was different because the audience was not like the one in Cabramatta. The one in Cabramatta, more than half Asian, you know what I mean? Whereas this one was mostly white people. But then one of the Vits pointed out to me afterwards, he goes, it was actually kind of cool too that there was lots of non-Vits, that people there were taking interest in our stories as well. And that matters as well. Like, it's not just talking to ourselves, but I was able to facilitate this conversation with Jiwei and with Andre, where we're talking about like stories which is at the heart of our concerns as the Vietnamese diaspora, and all these white people were there for it, listening intently as well. They walked away, they learned something about us, and that's beautiful too, right? Like that, even though it can be confronting when you look out and it's mostly like white people, but then I also want to say that was a great thing as well, to have both kinds of audiences.
Sheila, thank you so much. I enjoy the first time we talked, I enjoyed today, and I look forward to years to come because it's always fun to hear what's going on in Australia and Sydney and your corner of the world.
No, thank you so much. It's so good to chat to you because I know you get it. I know, and I follow your activities and I follow everything that's happening in California really closely because I can see that we're living in parallel worlds, right? That these concerns are the same in both of our contexts. We're all tied together as well. We're part of the global diaspora, right? But yet we also face some similar challenges of trying to, promote our stories and hang on to certain things and, change other things as well. But thank you so much for having me
One last time, where can we find more information on Min? Where is it and when does it go till?
Okay, so this is Min, here you go, 29th of April to the 14th of October. So it's on for ages. That's on for 6 months. I'm also going to have a few public programs. It's at the Fairfield City Museum and Gallery, which is in Smithfield. So not far from, where Cabramatta is and the other Viet areas. It's going to be, a really good couple of months still because I've still got, I'm doing a talk next month. I think I will focus on mental health and art. I think that's a really good topic for us. And then we'll have a family open day as well. So come check out the exhibition. Get in touch anytime if anyone's interested in, talking about this. I'm always here for, discussion.
Thanks again, Sheila. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.